My tip 4 would be find opportunities to share whatever you've read with other people. Because what that does is, the more they appreciate what you share, the more you have the incentive to keep reading more. Because, now you realize that you're not just reading in a vacuum. Whatever you are reading, people are actually appreciating it. So it gives you the drive and the incentive to keep reading. Because anytime they see you, they're okay, what do you have for us today? And looking back, I always used to see those people who always used to command our attention were always people who always have something to share. And not just sharing, not just talking about who is better between Ronaldo and Messi, that's a beer parlor discussion. But these are people who will say, here's something I read in the book. Here's the latest research. Here's what this author was talking about. And it used to always command everybody's attention. And the more you do that, and people appreciate it, the more you want to read more. There's also the case of Ben Carson, the neurosurgeon. Ben Carson was the dullest student in his class those days, grade 5 or so, okay? Until one day, where his mother insisted that he starts reading books, 1 or 2 books every week. So he developed that habit. And one day, the science teacher showed up in the class holding a rock and was asking the students, who can identify this rock? Nobody could identify it. Nobody could say anything about the rock. And don't forget that he was the dullest. And then he raised up his hand, and the class, they said, wow, this is going to be fun. But as soon as he started speaking, he said he got everybody's attention because he knew about the history of the rock. He could identify it. He could say a lot about the formation of the rock because he had read it. And he said that from that day on, he knew that having something valuable to say that other people are not yet aware of, it's just a very powerful feeling. And guess what, Kunle? He started reading more and more. Today, he's even a candidate for the U.S. presidential election. Ben Carson, is a hero. He's a role model.
And I think that's very powerful. The more you share what you read, the more inspired you will be to read, because people will find whatever you share very interesting, very fascinating, very useful. That's a very interesting one.
The same thing every time, so you have to have new things to share.
Yeah. Okay, now let's do the 5th tip now.
My tip 5, which is something I also discussed in the book, is to indulge in what I call active reading. Now, there's reading that is passive. If you are reading a newspaper, but when you are reading a book, okay, it's good to make notes. And I've come across people who, when they are reading, they're either highlighting things or underlining things. I love to read. I can't read a book without holding a pen, because in the course of reading, I'm coming across very powerful and very insightful information. So what I do is, I either underline or make notes at the margin or try to relate it to something I've read before. There's a book I read by Chief Operating Officer of Facebook, Sheryl Sandberg. She was talking about the founding of Google when she joined Google initially, okay, in her book. And I was shocked to find out that when she joined Google, Google was like a run-down place, They were in a small place, and the CEO, the co-founders were actually sharing office. So it was a very humble beginning. So when 10 years later, I was reading about this same Google, how massive it has become. So when I was reading that, I was underlining it because, it was interesting to see the transition of that organization, So active reading means whatever you are reading that is of interest and is insightful, underline it, highlight it, make a comment on it. Because when you are doing that, research has shown that kind of active reading aids comprehension as well, because it sinks deeper into your head. And what I also do is, when I finish reading a book from cover to cover, I actually go back to see what I have underlined. That way, the core of the book, resides in my consciousness and in my brain. So active reading is key.
That's another interesting one. Indulge in active reading. Active reading. Passive reading, active reading. So most people do passive reading when they are reading newspapers, all those other kinds of books. Okay. Let's go to the sixth tip now.
Yes, my sixth tip would be something that is a bit close to the first tip I mentioned, choosing books that reflect your interest. But this one is choosing books carefully. Okay, now the first tip about your interests is basically meant for people who want to begin to develop the habit of reading. And so, to start, you need that reading to reflect your interest. Because that way there's less effort, okay? But after you can't just be reading only things that interest you, but so over time, when you've developed what I call reading muscle, you can now begin to expand the scope of your reading. And that's where choosing carefully comes in. Choose the books you read carefully. For instance, you can read about certain interesting titles, okay? There's a book I read called The Smartest Guys in the Room, okay? It's about the collapse of Enron. But I remember that when I was reading this book, the title, it's very striking because I was in a hotel lounge and the barman came, saw the title and said, Oga, I'd like to read this book and buy it for my children. I said, why? Because he said, I want them to be the smartest guys in their class, But that book wasn't about how to become smart in class. It was just talking about how, Enron, which was a massive, massive energy company, collapsed almost overnight. So it was talking about people using their intelligence, in the wrong way, okay? I've read books about, from third world to first, Lee Kuan Yew. So from such titles, you can also begin to, over time, follow certain authors. There are certain authors that I'm very, very familiar with that I would read any book from them because over time I've gotten accustomed to how they write. They are great storytellers. Maxwell is one example. Jim Collins is another. Somebody like Malcolm Gladwell, Tipping Point, Blink, What the Dog Saw. These are people that just have a natural storytelling talent, okay? So, so it's good to not just focus on your interest alone. You can start with your interest, but over time, begin to find a way to broaden your reading. Biographies, for instance, very important for many people, politics and things like that. So that, again, is another way of broadening and encouraging reading beyond your interests.